Professor Ove Hoegh-Guldberg, welcome to the program.
It's great to be here.
Tell us about your Great Barrier Reef research.
Well, I've been working on the Great Barrier Reef for about 20 years now. And the questions I've been looking at relate to corals, coral reefs, and nowadays issues associated with the build-up of CO2 in the atmosphere. And the principal things I've been looking at are the impacts of global warming and ocean acidification on coral reefs. What we've discovered, and this is also other people's research, is that if you push the sea temperatures to 1 degree higher than the long-term summer average, so it's warmer by 1 degree over a month or so, what you end up with is something called coral bleaching. Now, since 1979, these events have swept across the planet, and the available evidence suggests that it's the warming of seas which has pushed corals closer to that threshold, so that warm summers now damage coral reefs.
So it's obvious that warming does affect the viability of corals. What do you put the warming down to? I mean, what do you attribute the warming to?
Well, I suppose what one has to do there is go to the best science available, which is the consensus at the international level provided by the IPCC. You look at all of the evidence from our understanding of how warming of the planet happens. You then look at the long-term records of CO2 and temperature and so on. And it comes down to the fact that, and there's also other bits of evidence from isotopes that show that it's a human signal that's driving up the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and leading to a slow but steady increase in global temperature.
Now, the attribution of global warming to human causes, that is actually the main point of contention. It's the main point of the debate around the world. Now, a lot of people, a lot of scientists in various areas are disagreeing with the conclusions of the IPCC. The IPCC that has said that it's very likely that most of the warming we've observed has been human caused or man-made. Now, a lot of people would disagree with that conclusion.
Well, I think if you look at the consensus, it's thousands versus perhaps a handful of scientists.
But when you say thousands, what do you mean by thousands?
Well, if you look at the people that contributed to the IPCC report that actually reviewed it, at that process that it goes through, the very rigorous process, we've got several thousand scientists of the very best. I mean, these are in the Australian, the US Academy and so on, who've signed on to this. Now, in any scientific issue, be it genetically modified crops or the Flat Earth Society, whatever, you're always going to have a few people that might dissent from the general opinion, and that's healthy. Science is inherently a skeptic process.
Is the science of the skeptics valid?
I have yet to see anything that's convincing evidence from the skeptic. I'm going on peer-reviewed scientific literature, and that's the only thing you can go on as a scientist, or indeed a policymaker. And
the IPCC is coming for a lot of criticism recently about use of non-peer-reviewed matter.
That's right, and if you look at that...
Glaciergate, Amazongate, a few
well, in fact, if you look at Amazongate,
that was a WWF document.
That's right, but you go back, that's a peer-reviewed scientific... It's based on peer-reviewed science. At the heart of that, if you go back to that thing, it's got a list of references at the back that are about that, and in fact, that whole stir by Jonathan Leake has no base. Now, with the Himalayan issue, there was a typo and a whole series of events. But if you look at the IPCC document, 3,000 pages of fine text.
Well, that's the party line. That's the political
line. Well, no, it's not the
line.
party line. It's actually reasonable. If you had a...
But it's one of their central conclusions.
Of course.
The melting of the Himalayan glaciers was one of their central conclusions. It's been shown to be false by several hundred years.
No, I don't think you'd call it a central conclusion. Right?
Well, it was one of the ideas.
Several thousand facts that comes out of that process. So there you have this hefty book, all of those references, thousands of scientists contributing, and if you didn't have a couple of errors, that would be very strange.
Now, going back to consensus, I mean, a lot of people have got a problem with the idea of consensus. Stephen Schneider himself has said, IPCC lead author, has said that the number of scientists involved in the IPCC process is less than 600. It's not 2,500 as has been claimed.
What I just said then was 450 writers. You have then a whole series of people that actually do the reviewing. You've also then got a community of scientists that numbers around 2,500.
But not necessarily scientists.
Signed it off.
Not necessarily scientists. The 2,500 is made up with advocates, government people.
I don't think that's true. It's one of the most rigorous scientific processes ever. It's frustrating. Because in fact what happened with the fourth assessment report was that it ended up very conservative with things like the Arctic sea ice. And in fact...
Arctic sea ice has recovered for the last 2 years.
Now, come on. At the moment, right, we've lost about 30 to 40% of the winter sea ice.
From what date? I mean, that comment has been criticised as well.
If you look at the IPCC, in fact you can look at the IPCC stuff, you see Arctic sea ice bumbling around like this, and about 2007 it goes outside the range of the worst case scenario. Now the recovery you're talking about is a tiny uptick. Now that's variability.
15% in 2008 and 10% in 2009.
But that's variability. That's variability around the signal. It's like waking up today and saying, oh, it's cool weather, so climate change isn't working. You've got weather and variability around it. Now at the moment, right, we're outside the worst case scenario of the IPCC, which means that Arctic summer sea ice will disappear by the end of this century. That hasn't happened. Just let me finish. That's the conclusion you come to. Now that hasn't disappeared in 1,000,000 years. Isn't that a bit strange?
No, well, not necessarily. It depends on when you're taking the data. If you're taking the data from the 1950s, if you took the data from the 30s, you probably wouldn't get anywhere near a picture.
I think I'd go with the people that are the experts.
Well, you can't appeal to authority in the scientific argument. Wouldn't you agree?
What do you mean by that?
Well, you just got there and said go with people who are experts.
Well, no, I think you have to go with the consensus scientific literature, right? And they're saying that the changes we saw over the past 5 years are extremely unusual relative to the long-term trend in sea ice in that area. So if you look at the long-term trends, measurements from satellites and reports on the ground and so on, going back into the 1800s, right? The current trend of opening sea, right, where you haven't had it before, is extremely unusual in terms of the long-term trend. In fact, if you look at the sedimentology, right, under the ice, which is where they're getting the information about the ice being extremely long-lived and having not disappeared in the last 1,000,000 years, they're telling us that this current trend in the long term is extremely unusual.
A lot of scientists would disagree with that as well because of the sparsity of data. Well, going back...
Which scientists? Are these glaciologists? Are these people that are expert in this area? Again, you've got to go to the people that are the experts, the consensus science.
What about Antarctic sea ice? They reached the maximum.
Well, I'm not an expert in Antarctic sea ice, so I'm not.
But doesn't it tend to make people think, well, if Antarctic sea ice is gaining, which it has been gaining 1% since the 70s?
No, that's been refuted in science a couple of years ago.
Well, is it lower or higher than what it was?
At the moment, right, it's starting to disappear.